Hello, you're listening to The Voice of Russia from London. I'm Simon Parker. Today we'll be discussing the challenges posed by urbanisation and ask if the world will be able to cope with an increasingly urban population in the future. This is because the latest forecast from the United Nations now predicts that 2/3 of the world's people will live in cities by 2050. The global population is set to reach almost 10 billion by that point, and the UN says that at least 6 billion people will live in cities. We'll be discussing what an urban population boom could mean and ask if our cities can cope as they grow into megacities. The UN says that there will be more than 40 of these so-called megacities by 2050, each with a population of over 30 million people. Today I'll be asking what our future of urbanisation could mean to the way we live and what challenges we face. With me to discuss this issue in the studio is Erich Sahan, a private sector advisor at Oxfam, and Dr. Alice Evans, a fellow in human geography at the London School of Economics and Political Science. And on the line we're joined by Melissa Sterry. Melissa is a design scientist, futurist, writer and speaker. As a starting point, I think it would be best to discuss this term urbanisation in quite general terms and what it means to you as individuals and how you interact with that in your line of work. Melissa Sterry, you're on the line. I think you're the best place to start. How are you interacting with this term urbanisation and how does it impact the way you work and the work you do?
Well, I would generally term or consider urbanisation as really anything that is non-rural, so I would integrate into that both cities and towns and in this day and age, out-of-town developments. And essentially with urbanisation, you're looking at what is essentially an anthropogenic, a human-created environment wherein our impact on that place is so significant that it will impact on Earth systems, it will impact on ecology, it will impact on potentially meteorology if the site is large enough, and potentially other systems too. So that's how I would define urbanisation and consider it within my work.
Erich Sahan, you're a private sector advisor at Oxfam. What does that mean and what do you do in your line of work and how does that tie in with what Melissa said?
Well, it ties in the following way, Simon. We work with business and markets to try to make sure that we've got long-lasting, sustainable solutions to poverty, and urbanisation is a massive spanner in the works in that work that we're currently combining throughout our operations in 94 countries that we work in. So we're seeing huge amounts of labour going from the rural agricultural economy to cities. We're seeing the average age of farmers rise up to well into the 60s. And this is a concern because agriculture has been traditionally where a lot of employment's been created and obviously where our food is grown. So it creates a huge issue for us, not least of all the migrant labour and the poverty issues and inequality that also is sparked by the kind of migration that we're seeing.
Dr. Alice Evans, you specialise in gender and international development. What does urbanisation mean to you and how is it impacting the world we live in today, in your opinion?
Well, I'd say maybe two things. One, to pick up on Erin's point, is that it's not the case that all urbanisation is driven by rural-urban migration. A lot of it is actually natural population increase. So that means that more people are being born than are dying. And that's because in urban areas we often see better access to services, better. So there's lower rates of infant mortality, fewer children are dying, and people live longer. So there are some positive aspects of urbanisation. If urbanisation is well managed. So one particular issue that I've been looking at is why urban people tend to be more supportive of gender equality. So in areas that are densely populated, you tend to have greater exposure to more heterogeneous practices. You're more likely to see a woman who's a businesswoman, and that might inspire kinds of change that you might not get so much in sort of more smaller, homogeneous communities in rural areas. So there can be some positive aspects of urbanisation in terms of infant mortality rates going down, in terms of changing attitudes towards girls' education. But, it's going to depend by place and according to how it's managed.
And you see that projecting into the future, you see that increasing, that improving in the future even more?
Well, across a range of studies, when we look at rural and urban areas, in the case of gender, we have much lower rates of infant mortality in urban areas and much greater support for gender equalities. But I wouldn't want to generalise or predict, make large predictions.
Erich, I think you'd like to say something here.
Yeah, I mean, just going on the back of that, one of the things that we're seeing in our work on the ground is the increasing amount of informal employment in the urban sector. So people migrating over from rural environments where they've got often networks of support. They've got childcare services through family, for instance, and once people, and particularly women, migrate to the urban sector, they're a lot of the time working in services and informal employment. So one of the things that concerns us is the vulnerability that creates. Are you, Alice, seeing that as a key challenge in your research?
Yeah, it is a massive issue. So, and actually a really important point, because of the decline of formal sector employment and increasingly precarious labour, it's not the case that we see urbanisation and rural-urban migration in all countries. So, for example, in Zambia, where my research is based, there was massive counter-urbanisation. People went back to the land in the 1980s and 1990s because privatisation, liberalisation, loss of formal sector jobs, the decline of the male breadwinner meant that people just couldn't cope in these difficult urban environments. So they tried to make a living in rural areas. So none of these things are guaranteed. It's very difficult to make long-term predictions. These are all contingent events.
Melissa Sterry, you join us on the line. How do you react to what these guys are saying in the studio, and what other problems are being faced right now within our increasingly urban existence?
I would agree with the sense of flux that came across in that discussion there, because we tend to see, particularly in, for example, the UN reports a lot of assumptions about what the future is going to look like, but as we've just found, there's on-the-ground events, sometimes unexpected, unprecedented, that send off these predictions into unknown directions. But one of the things that I'm seeing is that, particularly where disruptive innovation is concerned, where DIY technology, 3D printing, and really anything that enables people to, if you like, go back to a pre-industrial revolution state wherein they're building on site. Let's say, for sake of argument, that they're downloading a design for a prosthesis because they've lost a limb to a landmine. That is being built in somewhere in proximity to the community. It might be there is some regional centre, as opposed to being remote. In other words, that pre-industrial model. These kind of events are taking off in the most interesting ways in the developing world and in the rural areas where there isn't access to some of the infrastructure that we take for granted in the West. And because we're more or less at the start of that journey, we're only really several years into applying these new technologies. But what we have seen is quite radical. And so I think that's interesting, because that potentially, if you look, for example, at the uptake of smartphones and mobile phones in general, India would be one of the most significant places, because there, of course, when you're looking at rural communities, or when you're looking essentially outside of the economically empowered communities, that kind of technology can really change the game. And I think that's where we're going to see some of the biggest shifts, and potentially we might actually see some of these predictions as to urban density start to alter, because when you've got these new opportunities, it can make rural living, or indeed anything outside of the mega city, that much more appealing, and offset some of the problems that you might have in the urban context.
Dr. Alice Evans?
Yeah, I wanted to come into that point about the impact of media and how that can actually decrease the difference between rural and urban. So there's recently been some research in India, and it shows that when people were getting the television signal in the rural areas, and then they were being exposed to soap operas, then the fertility rates went down and the divorce rates increased. So it was the idea that people in rural areas were being exposed to alternative livelihoods, or alternative lifestyles rather, the sorts of things that we normally only see in urban areas, but they were getting it through TV. They were getting, and maybe you'd call that a disruptive technology, and so that radically changed things.
I'm interested in what you've just said then, and a point you made a couple of minutes ago about potentially how historically populations have migrated, transient populations have migrated between urban and rural environments, and if you can see any trends between perhaps affluence and being very poor, and what sort of trends you see these days.
So the sorts of people who migrate tend not to be the very poorest, but it's usually people with a little bit of capital, some assets. You need a social network in the urban areas, so you need someone that will help you get your foot in the door, really. It tends not to be the poorest who migrates, and that's the case for both international migration and rural-urban migration.
Emrich Sahan, what are you seeing in terms of population migrations, in terms of your work with Oxfam?
We are seeing that the urban populations are the drivers of growth. They're the drivers of job creation, and And also, a lot of the political capture is often in urban centres, and that concerns us as a civil society organisation trying to represent the views and interests of some of the most marginalised people, particularly in rural areas. It concerns us that the growing population is going to lead to even more sort of elite capture in some of those environments. So governance is a key issue for us, and making sure there's still investment in where that investment is needed.
What sort of an impact can organisations like Oxfam and other NGOs have on this kind of freight train urbanisation? Is there any way of them kind of clambering on and trying to slow things down, or is it going to run out of control?
I don't think it's our role to try to shift demographics or migration patterns or anything of that nature. I think what we need to really focus on is making sure that people living in slums have a voice, they're able to shape the way governments are investing into services, into infrastructure, but also people in the rural environment aren't ignored because of this sort of sexy new trend that necessarily comes in. And the key issue for us there is food security. It's something that's attracting less and less investment as a proportion of government spending across Africa, across the developing world, and that concerns us. So we really do need to see that more balanced approach.
I think it's this subject of food security which I find particularly interesting. This latest UN forecast suggests that 6 billion people will be living in cities. That means there's only 3.5 billion people living in rural areas. Are we putting too much strain on the rural community to produce enough food for all those people? Or will these so-called megacities in the future have to become even more sustainable than we could ever imagine?
I mean, the key issue there is that we've hit more or less productivity and yield increases to a point where it's very hard to increase them at any dramatic rate. So what we need to see is investment in smallholder agriculture, in the smaller producers, often the poorer people in the rural environment. And a lot of them, it's their kids that are moving to cities. I mean, the urbanization isn't only driven by migration, as Alice noted. A lot of it's through birth rates in urban centres, but the migration is often happening because the kids of people who are farmers aren't seeing enough prosperity, enough opportunity in farming anymore. And that's concerning. If you've got 70, 80-year-old people producing food for young people in the city, that doesn't seem sustainable.
Melissa, what's your vision for the way cities may look in the future in terms of what we've been discussing about sustainability and our large world population providing for itself in terms of enough food?
I think we're at a critical point in that we've been relatively naive until now as to quite what the impact of cities is, both in terms of infrastructure and how that impacts on, for example, if we were thinking about wildlife, the migratory routes of species. We just pretty much did what we wanted to, where we wanted to, so long as there was the economic infrastructure to back that up, and there was no real sense of possible forward accountability on the kind of impacts that might occur. However, we're getting much more switched on about this. For example, the relationship between cities and weather patterns, and for example, the fact that if you're going to build a city in a desert region, you're going to create the urban heat island effect, but also you might also simultaneously create high rainfall, which obviously if we're going to factor in climate change and the sort of extreme weather scenarios that are predicted, will put enormous stresses on the built environment. And I think, beyond that, obviously what happens when you've got a city is that you're hubbing really all of the needs into one site. You're creating this mass population with not just obviously food needs, but water and energy and materials and so on and so forth. And that in itself creates, if you like, a potential weakness in that it doesn't really take too much. I think it's something like 3 days. It's a period where if there was a major natural hazard event, we would see literally the economy starting to crumble and city infrastructure because there's so much coming into those cities from outside. It's not a distributed network. It's a very centralized network, and that can be very, very vulnerable. And there haven't really been the kind of lengthy and considered discussions that there really need to be around that. But obviously, at this time when we're seeing major events strike cities, including those in the developed world that historically have sort of gotten off pretty lightly, or at least in the last sort of few decades, the things are changing. So I think the general issue of resilience, not just in terms of food, but in all senses of the word, is very much at the forefront. And again, that is disrupting and will continue to disrupt, I think, our perception of really what and how the future city should operate at a functional level.
Dr. Alice Evans, the UN predict that 90% of this forecasted growth is predicted to take place in Africa and Asian countries. Does that surprise you? And does the developing world have the ability, and are they equipped to deal with this?
No, that doesn't surprise me. I suppose, reading about these things, this is in line with what we've been seeing over a long period of time. The UN report says that urban areas can be the drivers of growth, but we need to make sure that the benefits of growth are more equitably distributed. We need to make sure there are decent jobs, full employment, there's greater participatory, more inclusive urban governance. But this is the problem with these UN reports. They tend to give us these platitude of shopping lists without really looking at the power and the politics of how we might actually achieve some of these very complicated things. How do you make countries and local governments that aren't prioritising participatory, inclusive urban governance to do that? How do you get governments to work with local civil society organisations? How do you get governments not to destroy slums but to protect their security of tenure? In some contexts we find, so for example in Brazil, in Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo, we've had wonderful local governments prioritising participatory budgeting, and that's led to a massive redistribution of wealth, greater participation on the part of poorer people and also women. So it's a very difficult question of how do we get from this shopping list of ideas of access to safe water and reducing slums to actually getting that to happen. And that is what sort of Oxfam tries to do by working with local communities, getting people together, organising different networks, increasing people's voice and accountability.
Absolutely. The power in politics, I think that to me is the core of what we're talking about. How do we give voice, how do we give power to people that are used to being ignored, who don't have options for participating in decision making? And there isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. In terms of worker organisations, in terms of unions, those sorts of organisations have played a really important role, and we've seen a bit of a rollback on that front overall. In terms of farmers, we've seen producer organisations, for instance, in Colombia, lobby local government to allow for farmers markets to start being setting up in various cities. Those are the sorts of things we need to be supporting. It could be messy, and it probably requires a little bit of patience, but the end goal has got to be voice and participation for poor people, and then we'll start getting the kind of more equitable distribution of services and investment.
I'm very intrigued by this prediction by the UN that they suggest that there will be 40 of these so-called megacities by 2050, each with a population of over 30 million people. Is there the worry that these could become epicentres of poverty?
Absolutely. In emerging economies around the world, in developing economies around the world, every time I'm flying into these places, I'm seeing slums growing. I'm seeing services that are patchy at best. And a lot of it is because the governance structures aren't there to deal with it. A lot of the time, the local governments don't have the right kind of budgeting. They don't have the right systems to be able to predict what's going on. And that's not to say it can't be done. It certainly can be done. But it requires a very deliberate workforce or deliberate attempt by local government and by national level governments to listen to people that are coming in and make sure that those provisions are in place.
I just interject with that, and I think a really key thing, because to be honest, we're actually seeing it in the developed world, this what Alice was talking about, this, if you like, resistance or lack of ability to create participatory infrastructure, be that governance or design and co-creation. One of the major issues is in assumed intelligence, this idea that, a particular individual really has all of the answers. And in the very developed infrastructures and economies, we tend to see a lot of that, a lot of embedded assumed intelligence that essentially means a very, very small community of people are making the decisions because that's what they think is best. Although, you could look at that another way and you could say, well, that's what they know. Again, it's getting back to habits, which also came up earlier in this discussion. However, from a design innovation perspective, and particularly in the urban context, some of the very best projects, the projects that have not only added, the most in terms of innovation on site and that have really helped to transform communities, but within the global context that have genuinely spotlighted new ways of doing things, have happened as co-creation projects between slums and the likes of researchers and leading-edge designers. And there are some really cracking examples out there. For example, urban think tanks work. On one project they were working with a slum. They needed to get transport infrastructure into the slum. There wasn't the geography, there wasn't the topography to enable road infrastructure, and it wouldn't have been relevant because, many of the people were not car owners. So they put in a cable car network. In another project that's actually just in the early phase in Kailicha, one of the biggest slums in the world over in South Africa, working with solar energy companies such that the slum dweller owners can have a revenue income. They can put solar panels on the roof. That both serves their own energy needs. It serves the regional energy needs. As I said, it creates the income that further infrastructure can then be developed off the back of. And there's also a commercial need. So it's obviously got the potential for buy-in, both at a corporate and at a government level.
Dr. Alice Evans from the London School of Economics and Political Science. Will big always mean poor? It's hard not to see around the world a disparity between rich and poor in the biggest cities. Will that continue? Some
cities are marked by massive inequality, but I would say two things. One, we can't really generalise and there'll be specifics and it depends on urban governance in local areas. Two, we shouldn't be too fixated on these megacities. I mean, only 1 in 8 urban dwellers actually live in them. Most people are living in much smaller towns, so they need to be as much a focus of the attention, although I recognise the sort of headline shock factor of the megacities. I was going to address another point. So far, we were discussing the governance issues and the problems of urbanisation as if in poor countries, as if those problems are rooted in poor countries. Whereas we also need to recognise some of the global causes of the downsides of urbanisation. So, for example, if we think about climate change, in Lusaka, the capital of Zambia, they've had massive flooding last year, and that's partly a factor of what we here in London, for example, are doing in our pollution. So whether an urban area can be sustainable, whether people are living in crowded, flooded slums, whether the rural areas of Zambia can supply the towns and cities, really depends on the climate, which is a factor of what we're doing. So we need to be careful not to vilify and blame local governments in Africa and Asia, for example, for not managing things equitably, when many of the causes of poverty are actually have global causes, and climate change being one, and there are many others.
I'd like to try and move on to more of a positive note, if possible, because I've been thinking about a move towards urbanisation and a migration of populations to an urban setting. Is there the potential that more people living in close proximity with each other could potentially create a nicer, more liberal, understanding environment? Am I creating some sort of utopian fantasy, or is there the possibility that this could happen?
I mean, anecdotally, we can obviously see in our own lives when we interact with cities that some of the tribalistic barriers do get broken down when you're in close proximity. Bigotry is lessened when you start seeing that actually, regardless of someone's skin, you're seeing them every morning and they kind of look and live quite similar to the way you look and live and have got similar issues. So just seeing the fact that some of these artificial barriers that have divided us cause tribalistic conflicts can be broken down just by being engaged and being in direct proximity.
Melissa, will these urban environments that we live in over the course of the next couple of 100 years, will they be more inclusive, more liberal environments?
I think they will, and I think the understanding of the relationship between the city and rural communities, and indeed the global infrastructure, will very dramatically increase. And I think that will change the way that we, it will change our values and it will change the way that we see ourselves. Certainly, I agree with the idea that density of population and communities tends to promote understanding, and that, for example, if you were looking at the rise of the far right in Britain, the irony is that you often see it in those areas where immigration is relatively low and people haven't actually experienced immigration in a personal context, and therefore they're making assumptions and they're reading tabloid headlines and they're getting het up about something that actually might not be manifesting in the way that they perceive it to be. So certainly I think there are to density, but I think in a wider context, there are all sorts of things that are happening to, inform and to essentially improve potentially our understanding of the global context.
Dr. Alice Evans, we talk often about the economic necessity of migrating towards urban environments, but is there a portion of society who almost buy into this urban iconic status? There's almost an aspirational thing about living in the city. Does that still exist? I mean, will there?
Absolutely. So rural-urban migration is not only caused by an economic drive, it's affected by people's identities, how they want to present themselves to others. So we see across Africa, for example, when you interview people about why they're moving to an urban area, it's the bright lights of the city, the sense of independence, the sense of freedom, the sense of autonomy from being monitored by kin, the idea that if a man goes to the city and he makes some money, then it's a rite of passage, he's proved himself, he's acquired manhood. And similarly so for women, many women are increasingly migrating independently because they also desire that sense of modernity too. So the urban areas can enable a great degree of autonomy. They can also enable more liberal attitudes, as you were saying earlier, and that goes across for ethnicity, for race, and also for gender. But I think when we talk about whether urban areas necessarily are more conducive to greater understanding, we can also think that urban areas are also marked by great inequality. So clearly, if we think of Qatar and the great wealth there, but that's also marked by masses of deaths of migrant labourers coming over from other areas. So urban areas don't necessarily engender all forms of equality.
Emrich Sahan, there almost seems to be a very fine line between the utopian, dystopian iconography of the city and the urban environment. You only have to look at cinema, for example, look at things like Blade Runner, for example. There's a very fine line, isn't there? And how do you think that may be portrayed in the future?
Hopefully, the fact that we're going to see more and more urbanisation is just going to make more and more obvious the inequalities that underlie what we have already in society. So to me, it's a magnifying glass on the problems that we already have. Nothing that we've really discussed from a poverty perspective is necessarily purely unique to the urban environment. You've got informal labour issues in the rural environment. You've got food security issues there. You've got broader job creation issues. You've got gender disempowerment issues and women's discrimination issues. So all of this is there in both. But I think what the city is going to do increasingly is going to put a magnifying glass on those inequalities and kind of confront our decision makers about them. You can't, if you're living in the same place where the slum is and you're driving through it every morning to your office, to your ivory tower, you can't really ignore it. And it's easier to ignore some of these problems when they're far away from you in the rural environment.
Melissa, we just have a couple of minutes left. I'd like to ask if you have anything to add to what these people in the studio have said.
I think the most important thing in the conversation is diversity of perspectives and, as I said, not assuming that a particular community has all the answers. And to give an example of that, I was in India earlier this year on a Future Cities research project, and I was driving down a very long stretch of road, and one half of it was slums, and the other half was very, very expensive developments that were gated communities, and they were literally said 50% was the slums, and then there were these gated communities. What was really evident was that whereas the slum dwellers were brushing away the rubbish, they were essentially self-organising. It was bottom-up organisation, wherein they were taking pride and care in their community. The moment, literally, that the road hit the gated communities, outside of the gates, rubbish was piled up. And it was because those within the gated communities were not stepping outside of the gate and clearing up the trash, and there wasn't the infrastructure in that region for public services to do that. And I think that just little caveat, that little story says a lot about the fact that sometimes you find the solutions in unexpected places, and you shouldn't assume that just because a place looks ramshackled and unloved and maybe the roofs leak that actually that isn't a place where some things are functioning immensely well. And there might be a great sense of community, there might be very, very strong ties such that when, for example, a disaster strikes, that community can mobilise in a way that the gated community may not, would be my key message.
Unfortunately, that's all we have time for today, but I'd like to thank my guests for joining me. I was joined in the studio by Erinch Sahan, a private sector advisor at Oxfam, and Dr. Alice Evans, a fellow in human geography at the London School of Economics and Political Science. And on the line, we were joined by Melissa Sterry. Melissa is a design scientist, futurist, writer and speaker. You've been listening to The Voice of Russia from London, and from me, Simon Parker, goodbye. Hello, you're listening to The Voice of Russia from London. I'm Simon Parker. Today we'll be discussing the challenges posed by urbanisation and ask if the world will be able to cope with an increasingly urban population in the future. This is because the latest forecast from the United Nations now predicts that 2/3 of the world's people will live in cities by 2050. The global population is set to reach almost 10 billion by that point, and the UN says that at least 6 billion people will live in cities. We'll be discussing what an urban population boom could mean and ask if our cities can cope as they grow into megacities. The UN says that there will be more than 40 of these so-called megacities by 2050, each with a population of over 30 million people. Today I'll be asking what our future of urbanisation could mean to the way we live and what challenges we face. With me to discuss this issue in the studio is Erinch Sahan, a private sector advisor at Oxfam, and Dr. Alice Evans, a fellow in human geography at...
And this is a concern because agriculture has been traditionally where a lot of employment's been created and obviously where our food is grown. So it creates a huge issue for us, not least of all the migrant labour and the poverty issues and inequality that also is sparked by the kind of migration that we're seeing.
Dr. Alice Evans, you specialise in gender and international development. What does urbanisation mean to you and how is it impacting the world we live in today, in your opinion?
Well, I'd say maybe two things. One, to pick up on Erinch's point, is that it's not the case that all urbanisation is driven by rural-urban migration. A lot of it is actually natural population increase. So that means that more people are being born than are dying. And that's because in urban areas we often see better access to services, better, so there's lower rates of infant mortality, fewer children are dying, and people live longer. So there are some positive aspects of urbanisation. If urbanisation is well managed. So one particular issue that I've been looking at is why urban people tend to be more supportive of gender equality. So in areas that are densely populated, you tend to have greater exposure to more heterogeneous practices. You're more likely to see a woman who's a businesswoman, and that might inspire kinds of change that you might not get so much in sort of more smaller, homogeneous communities in rural areas. So there can be some positive aspects of urbanisation in terms of infant mortality rates going down, in terms of changing attitudes towards girls' education. But, it's going to depend by place and according to how it's managed.
And you see that projecting into the future, you see that increasing, that improving in the future even more?
Well, across a range of studies, when we look at rural and urban areas, in the case of gender, we have much lower rates of infant mortality in urban areas and much greater support for gender equalities. But I wouldn't want to generalise or predict, make large predictions.
Erinch, I think you'd like to say something here.
Yeah, I mean, just going on the back of that, one of the things...
The London School of Economics and Political Science. And on the line, we're joined by Melissa Sterry. Melissa is a design scientist, futurist, writer and speaker. As a starting point, I think it would be best to discuss this term urbanisation in quite general terms and what it means to you as individuals and how you interact with that in your line of work. Melissa Sterry, you're on the line. I think you're the best place to start. How are you interacting with this term urbanisation and how does it impact the way you work and the work you do?
Well, I would generally term or consider urbanisation as really anything that is non-rural. So I would integrate into that both cities and towns and in this day and age, out-of-town developments. And essentially with urbanisation, you're looking at what is essentially an anthropogenic, a human-created environment wherein our impact on that place is so significant that it will impact on Earth systems, it will impact on ecology, it will impact on potentially meteorology if the site is large enough, and potentially other systems too. So that's how I would define urbanisation and consider it within my work.
Erinch Sahan, you're a private sector advisor at Oxfam. What does that mean and what do you do in your line of work and how does that tie in with what Melissa said?
Well, it ties in the following way, Simon. We work with business and markets to try to make sure that we've got long-lasting, sustainable solutions to poverty, and urbanisation is a massive spanner in the works in that work that we're currently combining throughout our operations in 94 countries that we work in. So we're seeing huge amounts of labour going from the rural agricultural economy to cities. We're seeing the average age of farmers rise up to well into the 60s.